as to how Detroit arrived at the condition where it is now, if you look at the way Americans have used cities historically, this city is entirely typical. As I said, the most typical place in the United States. Until the 1920 census, the majority of Americans were not urban. We didn't become urban until the 1920 census, when the majority of us lived in cities of 10,000 or more. The cities peaked in their power and prominence around the 1950s. By the 1970s, the central cities were already losing out to suburbia, and by 1980, we had become the first suburban people in the history of our species on the planet. So if you look at the history of Detroit, it follows exactly that trajectory. From being a relatively small town in the 19th century, booming on into the 1950s, when it reaches its peak population, and then it began immediately to shrink. So it's following in an exaggerated way the same trajectory, the rocket ride demographically up and down of the great American cities. Again, it looks like an exception because it's so exaggerated, but it's simply the most American place. In that sense also, it looked like the place where people had finally found a solution. And this is one of the things that I think is too quickly and easily forgotten about Detroit. Detroit's not a failure. It is simply the single most successful thing Americans have ever built. It's a great, heroic success story. People came from all over this country, from all over the world, in fact, to build an industrial complex here in Detroit, a machine that created wealth so quickly and on such vast scale that no one had ever seen anything like it. The tsunami of wealth went rushing out of this city along the first concrete paved highways in human history out into the great green world of suburbia, carrying everything before it. So in that sense, this is exactly the American success story. It looked like a solution to organizing labor, organizing people, teaching them what they needed to know to make a middle-class life available to people who were working with their hands on the line.
Detroit underwent enormous change in the 20th century. The introduction of the Model T and the assembly line held the promise of middle-class life for all. Auto manufacturing, it seemed, was the key to bringing the American dream to the masses. Detroit was the dreamland in the mid-1900s for anyone who wanted to build an honest life. In the 50s, Detroit had the highest rates of homeownership in the country. Today, 48% of children in Detroit proper live in poverty. In the last year, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported Detroit's jobless rate at just under 30%, but Mayor Dave Bing and other city officials suggested that the actual jobless rate was closer to 50%. Detroit is a city that experienced the fruits of the American dream at an accelerated pace, and is left today with the consequences of America's 20th century ambitions.
Detroit used to be one of the greatest cities in the world. Boy, it is beautiful. Wasn't no vacancies. They had all kind of businesses downtown. Wasn't no vacancies at all. Right over there used to be a barber shop and a jewelry store. See how they're closed up?
How would I describe the state of Detroit today? In desperate need. In desperate need of dedicated folks, committed folks to provide education and training for those that are in need. I see Detroit in a state of emergency right now. It's number one, number two, number three. One of those, top three for unemployment, the top three in terms of lack of education, dropout rate. So I see Detroit just needing attention, just needs some tender loving care. Once it gets that, it'll be back to the powerhouse that it was 20, 25 years ago.
And when people talk about race relations, there wasn't a problem with race relations. There was a problem with Appalachian white police and black people. What they used to do to us was totally inhuman. And what happened with a lot of the black people, they used to see white business people who treated them well but saw this injustice and did nothing about it. And this is why when riots broke out, they see the way we are being abused, our human rights is being trampled on, and we knew if they would have protested or showed up in court, a lot would have changed, but they always say, I can't get involved. And that's what used to bring that animosity to that point.
I think one of the ways that I see it changing in the near future is large amounts of people coming, largely white, recent college graduates coming from other cities because studio space and housing is cheap. I think every city needs a mix of people in order to be vibrant and to exist. I think one of my concerns is that one of the things that happens in a city that becomes poor through no fault of its citizens, but largely through some of the racist practices in real estate and corporations, is that the path of gentrification always tends to push it towards the white and the affluent. And one of the things that I would hope for is that Detroit retains the populations that have struggled with it and built it creatively, which at this point is 80% African American. And if that balance shifts in favor of people who are coming from the outside without recognizing the hard work and the creativity, the music and the food and the community and the excitement that comes from the people that are currently living there, we lose some of the magic of Detroit. The way that it can really be dynamic in the future is not to go the way of every gentrifying city and have Starbucks at every corner, but to have something that is really Detroit, which is made up of those sounds. I think some of the things that bring people to Detroit we don't want to lose in any way by shifting that balance. And I think one of the greatest things that art can do is in the spirit in which people work together rather than work separately. So as new people come to the city, what I hope is that they live and work in neighborhoods that are as complex as the city can be in the future.
I think, you know, the people who started to come down in the early 90s, they were coming down at a really exciting time because, you know, the techno scene was sort of exploding, the indie rock scene was just starting to kick off, and when they were coming down here, you know, it wasn't to change anything. It was because they didn't want to be a part of that mainstream America that was happening in the 90s. I think a lot of us in the 90s saw like a gross mismanagement across multiple levels, whether it's in corporations, you know, the attitude of all press is good press. It just wasn't real almost, you know. I mean, and that you've seen the after effects, you know, the real estate, you know, bursting, sort of attitudes changing about how things are supposed to be run, attitudes toward corporations, the distrust against corporations. You know, they didn't come down here to change anything. They just wanted to be something else, and they had to be. I mean, you know, when I moved down here, it wasn't because I thought that Detroit was such a great place to live, or because I thought, you know, the education system down here, you know, with DPS was so great that I could start a family right away or something. It was because I wanted to be something else. It wasn't, I mean, granted, I mean, I want to change Detroit and I want it to change for the better. But I didn't come down here to change something. I came down here to be something else. Now that, you know, I mean, I guess the argument could be made that that's changing something, you know, of course, but that wasn't like my intention when I moved down here, you know. And I wouldn't even say that I'm a part of that first wave that came down here. I'm certainly not. You know, I think I'm more of the connector between that first wave and the people who are moving down here now, who see all these different opportunities.
I bought my first house because I felt that there was going to be development, that I would eventually, if I didn't own my own home, be moved out through development. I'd be priced out of where I love to be, which was in the Cass Corridor Cultural Center area. Now there's people living below me in the Cass Corridor, which was off limits way back, you know, when I was there. They're college kids, the young women riding their bikes up 2nd Avenue. It's more accepting, like, you don't, before it was just such a battle to explain to people why you want to do this, why you want to be here. Even to explain to even my friends that were my age when I was 20, I tried to convince them to stay here, and they move off to New York or wherever. Now people from New York and San Francisco are moving here, which is a weird thing. That it's refreshing, but at the same time though, there does need to be that I guess recognition that there are people here before you that have experience and understanding of what's going on and know the history that they can share with you. But then what the younger people coming in can bring new ideas, new energy, renewed enthusiasm.
You definitely see a lot more young people and, you know, people riding around on bikes and running around. You know, you didn't necessarily used to see that, you know, at all. I mean, people would be afraid to go running around at 10 o'clock at night or something in this neighborhood. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's kind of like a catch-22. I mean, the people who came down here in the beginning, you know, in some ways they don't want it to change too much, but, you know, change is inevitable and you have to change with the times. So in some ways it's sort of like sad to see that sort of culture start to open up to all these other things. But in another way, I mean, of course it's great because, you know, we needed that anyways. But when I first came down here, it was just sort of like a very, like a beautiful disaster in some weird way. I don't know how else to describe it. You know, it was just sort of like a very, yeah, beautiful disaster, I think is like the one, I think a term that would be proper for it.